There's some new research on caffeine, and if you are a coffee lover, energy drink lover, or someone who's a fan of pre-workout, you're not going to want to miss this episode.
What's up and welcome to Sam Miller Science, where you're joining me just over a decade into my personal journey of working to bridge the gap between metabolism, macros, muscle, and medicine, all while helping coaches scale the impact that they desire and deserve. If you are here, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me to help you elevate your coaching game or to lead you in your transformation to realize your true potential. In either case, each week I'll be sharing my methods, models, and message to serve as leverage for your specific goals. Without further ado, let's get on to today's show.
Now, this research was looking into the fact that maybe even a single cup of coffee could be impacting someone's sleep at night. Now, there's been research in the past on caffeine around delayed onset muscle soreness, exercise performance, being helpful for fatigue, or potentially helping to overcome sleep impairments or dealing with time periods of acute fatigue or sleep deprivation. Now, when we look at coffee and caffeine, usually there's a lot of sort of caveats around consumption. Don't necessarily drink too much. Let's pay attention to your total milligram consumption or total milligram amount, and also paying attention to the cutoff for caffeine. But this particular research was diving into looking at essentially caffeine consumption earlier in the day and if it was still impacting someone's sleep overall. Now, just to kind of lay the groundwork for today's episode, we have to understand that caffeine is one of the most widely consumed substances in the world. At this point, about 80% of the world consumes caffeine through some sort of medium, whether it's coffee or anything else. I mean, coffee is second after water in terms of beverage consumption. It's also estimated that about 30 to 45% of the world's population is lacking adequate sleep, meaning we could benefit a little bit in the recovery department through getting some better sleep and R&R. It's pretty much a no-brainer that if you want good sleep, you should avoid caffeine consumption close to bedtime. That's something that I've covered in my content in the past. If you haven't checked out any of my previous episodes on caffeine or coffee, definitely dive into the audio version of the podcast, which is on Apple Podcasts and Spotify in the Sam Miller Science feed. But when it comes to caffeine cutoffs earlier in the day, this is where we're sort of diving in a bit further in terms of the research and what I'm going to be covering inside today's episode. What time should we really be cutting off caffeine consumption in order to obtain optimal sleep quality? A lot of factors go into how fast we process caffeine, but a new meta-analysis examining the effects of caffeine on sleep can give us a little bit more of some tailored recommendations or kind of harder boundaries or guidelines when it comes to sleep and caffeine. And for some people, there may be reason to cut out caffeine altogether. Now, don't get too depressed here for my caffeine and coffee lovers. There may be a way that you can fit this in terms of your schedule and still maintain the benefits when it comes to exercise performance or overall cognition. So first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about caffeine metabolism and the half-life of caffeine. Now, the half-life of caffeine can vary drastically amongst different people. And this can be anywhere from like 2 to 12 hours, solely based on genetic variation, and then other lifestyle factors can extend or shorten the half-life as well. So for example, alcohol is one of those things that can impact the half-life. For those of you who are unaware of terminology related to things like half-life, usually it's used in the pharmaceutical industry, but for substances like caffeine, we would certainly consider the half-life as well. So a half-life is the amount of time that it takes a drug to get out of your system. If we want to layer the lifestyle factors that extend caffeine half-life, we can start to get into some situations where caffeine is basically staying in your body or hanging around in the bloodstream longer than it should. For example, the most commonly used drug that would do this would be oral contraceptives. So a lot of women who are taking hormonal birth control, this could be something that impacts the metabolism of caffeine. In one study, oral contraceptives that were basically provided to women extended the caffeine half-life to an average of 17 hours, and one subject even had a half-life of 25 hours, so more than a full 24-hour day in terms of the drug half-life. Other things that will make caffeine last longer in your system could include being obese or overweight. Grapefruit juice, interestingly enough, although I don't know many younger folks drinking grapefruit juice these days or mixing their caffeine with grapefruit juice, that would be certainly one way to extend the half-life of your pre-workout, mixing those two together. Alcohol is a big one, so 3 drinks were shown to extend caffeine's half-life by about 72%, which is pretty massive. Certain cardiovascular drugs like calcium channel blockers are also reason to potentially extend that caffeine half-life, and pregnancy. So caffeine's half-life is significantly extended during the third trimester due to high progesterone levels. And so this is one of the reasons why pregnant women should potentially be cautious with their caffeine consumption. So you can see there are numerous different lifestyle factors that are going to impact how individuals respond to caffeine and why tailoring your dosing and the timing of that dosing is important for the best results. Now, here's the new research, and this is a study from 2023, and basically looking at the effect of caffeine on subsequent sleep. Now, in this study, this was a study of 24 different studies, which is really nice because you get better quality of evidence and data when you have a study or review paper that's looking at all of these different other papers. Their sole intent with publishing this was to give solid recommendations on when caffeine should be cut off for the best quality sleep. One of the things they looked at was just any caffeine consumption versus no caffeine consumption and how that impacted sleep. And what they found might surprise you. Compared to no caffeine consumption, people who drank any caffeine had on average 45 minutes less total sleep time, a 7% reduced sleep efficiency. It took them 9 minutes longer to fall asleep on average. They had 1 to 3 more nighttime wake-ups than non-caffeine consumers. And in terms of sleep stages, they spent a higher percentage of time in light sleep and less in deep sleep. Now, don't be scared into thinking that you have to completely quit coffee or cut out caffeine in order to get a good night's rest. There are ways to work around this. This analysis of any caffeine that they had in the research included caffeine closer to bedtime, which is a major confounding variable, which is why it's always important to look at the details and methods of studies, not just solely the abstract of the study or just what outcomes are posted in things like social media or on news, mainstream media, or magazines. They also looked at, basically, the researchers were able to dig into the data a little bit more and really visualize the exact dose of caffeine and cutoff time where it wouldn't impact sleep. Now, these results might also surprise you. They broke down specific recommendations using caffeine amounts here, and here's the quote from the research paper. To avoid reductions in total sleep time and efficiency, 1 cup of coffee, about 107 milligrams of caffeine, should be consumed at least 8.8 hours prior to bedtime, and a standard serving of pre-workout, which was about 217.5 milligrams of caffeine, should be consumed about 13.2 hours prior to bedtime. These are pretty conservative numbers compared to what the average health or fitness influencer talks about. And I've even talked about caffeine cutoffs in the past and trying to be done around lunchtime or early afternoon. But depending on when you go to bed, that advice may be leaving you to where you're seeing some sleep impairments from your caffeine consumption. So a lot of people in the health and fitness space, myself included, I've mentioned noon or 1 p.m. or maybe no later than 2, depending on when you go to bed. And sometimes people don't even address the amount of caffeine. So the accumulation of caffeine in your system throughout the day is going to be important because you have the half-life from the first sort of taste of caffeine that you had, and then you have the half-life from second consumption later in the day. These researchers show total caffeine dose clearly matters, and the more you drink, the earlier your cutoff should be for best sleep. So if you are someone who's an avid caffeine consumer, the earlier you can have your caffeine cutoff, the better. If you're someone who's only having maybe 1 cup of coffee, then you might be able to get away with it being just a little bit further back. Now, still, we do want to abide by that caffeine cutoff because it can improve overall sleep quality. Remember, in the research, they saw improved total sleep time, better sleep efficiency. When people were consuming caffeine, their sleep latency was worse, and they had more nighttime wake-ups. So all the more reason to pay attention to our caffeine consumption if we are looking to optimize our sleep. So most of us will need an early cutoff. Now, there are some people who may be able to consume caffeine 3 to 4 hours of bed and sleep just fine because of the rate at which they metabolize that caffeine, but this is incredibly rare. I wouldn't say it's the most common thing, and to be safe, you might as well add that buffer in, and most people aren't exactly needing that caffeine later in the day anyways. Most people are done with work, they are done working out, so there's only a few sort of use cases or situations. Remember, caffeine also will have sort of this mildly thermogenic effect and raise body heat, which can make it harder to go to sleep. If you combine that with alcohol, that's going to make it even worse. So really pay attention to these lifestyle factors as well. Now, bringing this into the real world for yourself, or if you're a coach and you work with clients, you could troubleshoot treat this multiple ways. If your client is struggling with sleep and they're doing kind of the basics when it comes to their sleep and circadian hygiene, if you're interested in more tips on this, I do have a number of episodes on sleep optimization, improving sleep and recovery in the audio version of my podcast, which is at Sam Miller Science on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. But what we could do if someone was struggling here was an experiment of both reducing the total amount of caffeine and deploying an earlier caffeine cutoff. Now, it's important to meet your client where they're at with this. If they want to experiment with total abstinence or just kind of withdraw caffeine from the equation completely, then certainly they could do that. I would say if and when they introduce caffeine, do a small amount and have a very early cutoff. So maybe it's at breakfast or they're having it mid-morning, as opposed to that lunchtime, afternoon, or evening caffeine. I think where people really get in trouble in the fitness industry is those evening workouts where there's caffeine consumption prior to the evening workout, and then it's really impacting sleep, both because of body temperature and we still have that, have to consider that total caffeine half-life as well. Now, if we do sort of deploy that caffeine cutoff and we reduce caffeine and see improvements in sleep, we'd obviously want to be consistent with that. And getting better sleep is going to improve energy levels over time. It may take more than a day to see that take effect, so be patient and see how it plays out overall. As a reminder, before we close, I'm going to repeat the numbers that the researchers came across and how you might use this in your individual health journey or if you're a coach working with clients. 1 cup of coffee, or around 110 milligrams of caffeine, they found that it was best to cut that off around 8.8 or 9 hours before bed. 1 lower powered pre-workout. Now remember, pre-workouts sometimes have 200, 300, 400 milligrams of caffeine. Here they're referencing a 200 milligram of caffeine pre-workout. It's just slightly over that, and the best way to avoid sleep detriment was to consume this about 12 to 13 hours before bed. So again, the more caffeine there is, the earlier the cutoff. And most people are consuming, especially people who are using pre-workout, I would say a lot of people either have energy drinks or they're consuming coffee. Now with coffee, usually you're getting that sort of lower threshold or lower consumption overall. Now this can vary, right? Because espresso might be different than just regular drip coffee. You know, people having double shots, if you're having cold brew or nitro cold brew. Remember, coffee does have different concentrations in terms of caffeine, blonde roast versus other roasts. So be savvy when it comes to your caffeine consumption and do a little bit of research so you can be strategic with this and staying, under these total thresholds. And if you are going to consume more, let's say you do have multiple cups of coffee or you're someone who enjoys your caffeine, it is going to be very, very important to deploy that earlier cutoff to avoid any issues with your sleep. I would use these as a guidepost, but obviously due to the fact that there are some genetic differences in the metabolism of caffeine, and people may have variation due to things like body fat percentage and the other drugs that they may be taking, not everyone's going to have the same dose response to caffeine. And so play around with this accordingly, figure it out, and then you'll be able to determine how caffeine and stimulants are impacting your sleep individually. I'm not anti-caffeine, I'm situationally pro-caffeine. I think it can be great in situations for athletes. I think it can be good for both cognitive and athletic performance. There's research to support its use from a performance perspective and a strength training perspective, and it can be helpful if someone's dealing with some sleep impairments, short-term sleep loss, and as a way to kind of work around that. Now, if that continues over time, we may need to address the root cause for the sleep loss, but if this is something that's going to be somewhat temporary, like travel or other reasons, then it may be okay to include a bit of caffeine there. Just be mindful of your cutoff and your total milligram consumption throughout the day. There are, again, some sort of outliers here, people who can get away with it, but just because they can doesn't mean that you can. So be cautious and mindful when it comes to your overall caffeine intake. So we're not necessarily demonizing coffee. Doesn't mean that you can't ever have maybe something that contains caffeine before your workout or before some sort of important cognitive task, but use this research to hopefully better support a healthy lifestyle and make sure you're optimizing your sleep, since that's very important in the performance, longevity, and body composition equation. If you're interested in more content like this, make sure you are subscribed on YouTube at Sam Miller Science and give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the episode. If you're listening on audio, the best way to support the show is either leaving a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or a 5-star rating on Spotify, or screenshot the episode and share it with someone who might benefit. Maybe you have another caffeine lover in your life, or you have a client that you're working on this type of caffeine cutoff with and they're wanting to understand the rationale behind it, simply screenshot the episode or grab a copy of the podcast URL and just drop it in a text message or a DM, whatever you feel most comfortable with. But it helps to support the work that my team and I do here, the research behind the show, and the production of the podcast and video platform. Thank you so much for listening to this episode all about caffeine. I hope you enjoy it, and I will talk to you in the next show.